Good evening, everybody. I don't know how many of you were here last night. I know certainly some of you were, but just want to endorse that welcome, really. And if you were here last night, I think you'd agree that it was a really excellent event. My name's Richard Outram. I'm the secretary of something called the UK and Ireland Nuclear-Free Local Authorities, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about shortly. I'm delighted to be with you here tonight in this wonderful town of Kendal, which has been very hot today, hasn't it? Which of course is known as the gateway to the Lake District. I'd like to thank the staff at the museum for inviting me, and also Marianne Berkby from Radiation Free Lakeland and Lakes Against the Dump for organising this event, who's obviously fought for a long time, many years valiantly against the nuclear industry and the damage that it does in Cumbria, so thank you for inviting me tonight. Basically what I'm going to do is give you a bit of an overview about the latest plans to locate something called the geological disposal facility in West Cumbria, and also look at what you can do if you're so inclined to do so to help to fight it. I should say as well that in the publicity I'm very grateful to Marianne for not describing me as an expert, because unlike my esteemed colleague Dr Ian Fairlie, who is, and most certainly I'm not, rather I'm an activist. I'm somebody with a passion for fighting injustice and certainly for fighting against nuclear power and nuclear weapons, which is why I'm in this position. I'm actually a Peace graduate at the University of Bradford, so that's kind of my background. But this is like many injustices. It's very much a fight of David against Goliath, and certainly the nuclear industry has got a lot of power behind that Goliath. But luckily we've perhaps got the slingshot, so who knows? Let's give it a go. So let's just move on. Right, sorry, technology may not really mix very well. So this is what I wanted to cover really. Just first of all set out a little bit about what the nuclear-free local authorities are, or what our position is on nuclear power and nuclear waste. I wanted to look at what a geological disposal facility is, or GDF, why a GDF is being looked at, where the nuclear industry, where's the nuclear industry and the government looking to potentially locate a GDF in Cumbria, and I'll also reference the other site in Lincolnshire as well. A little bit about the procedures and timelines and criticisms of the process, and finally what you can do to oppose a GDF. It's a lot to cover in the time that we've got, and what I have done is I've actually given out some sheets at the end, and there's a number of websites on there. There's lots and lots of useful information that you can get from those websites that will help inform you more about the GDF. And certainly on our website there's an awful lot about the geological disposal facility. So let me just, if I may, if you'll indulge me, just give you a little bit of background about the nuclear-free local authorities. I've been in post since November of 2021. I'm the latest secretary in an organisation that's existed for over 40 years. Essentially, the nuclear-free local authorities were born out of the declaration, which you can see in these plaques on the left-hand side, the declaration in Manchester as the world's first nuclear-free local authority in November 1980. As a result of that, hundreds of local authorities in the UK and around the world declared themselves nuclear-free local authorities. And then in the UK, about 75 local authorities came together the following year in the autumn of 1981 to a conference in Manchester where they actually formed a nuclear-free local authorities network. So it's existed throughout that time, and it's always been based in Manchester as the world's first nuclear-free local authority. So hence why I'm in post. It's quite ironic really, because I'm sure many of you are aware that Manchester was actually the city in which the atoms first split by Ernest Rutherford at the University of Manchester, so it's kind of coming full circle really set this up. But essentially, for over 40 years, the NFLA has been, in effect, the voice of local authorities opposed to nuclear power, supporting renewables. But we're also a member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, so we also have that element as well. And in effect, in 1980, it was born out of the fact that the then Thatcher government wanted local authorities to collaborate in nuclear war civil defence planning, and essentially Manchester could see no point in it. It seemed as a futile and costly activity. So hence the refusal and hence the resolution. So we have now authorities in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland at every level. So some are cities, some are towns, some are little parish councils. We also have individual councillors who are affiliated. So if there's anybody here who's a councillor or represents a council who might be interested, please talk to me or contact me after the event. I'd be very happy to talk to you about that. So, of course, Cumbria has been kind of synonymous with the nuclear industry, and here I wanted to put this picture in because essentially it's the Our Late Queen opening Calder Hall, and really ever since that point in the early 50s, obviously Cumbria's been, West Cumbria certainly has been associated with nuclear power. I just wanted to have a look at what our position was on nuclear power, why we were opposed to it as a nuclear-free local authority network. Sorry, first Simpsons reference, you've got to get one in at least. So some of this is fairly obvious really, but the time and cost factor, you know, nuclear power stations are hugely costly and take enormous amounts of time to actually build and begin to operate. The average, the government's own estimate is at least 17 years on average. If we look at the current only nuclear power station being built in the UK, Hinkley Point C, which you'll have heard a lot about in Somerset, that's been built by EDF Energy, which is a British arm of the French state-owned EDF company. Originally, when that first started to build, when it was conceptualised, the then CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of EDF, said very optimistically that Hinkley Point C would be producing electricity that British people could use to cook turkeys in Christmas 2017. The latest estimate is the earliest operating date for the first reactor will be at least 2031 and probably not operational till 2032. The other thing to bear in mind is the cost. The original cost estimate was 18 billion, but now if that's projected, that same cost estimate would be 35 billion. But these figures are a bit meaningless because they're based on 2015 figures. If you actually then factor in inflation, the latest estimate I saw from Bloomberg yesterday was £47.8 billion. In fact, what I'd suggest you do, if you go on Wikipedia and look at the world's most expensive buildings, Hinkley Point C is about something like 3 or 4 on the list, and probably getting higher. Interestingly enough, the GDF might be much more expensive than this, so let's see. The other issue, of course, is risk. I mean, when we think about nuclear power stations, obviously everybody's aware of Chernobyl, Fukushima, but of course in Cumbria, the Windscale fire in 1957 was enormously damaging and was pretty miraculous that it actually, it wasn't a much worse disaster than it was. But what people sometimes don't maybe factor in as much is, and Ian knows a lot more about this than me, is the kind of insidious long-term damage to the environment from constant discharges and leaks from nuclear power stations and the impact on the environment. So it's, you know, it's water courses, it's the air, it's beaches, and obviously that has an impact on human health. I referenced this yesterday about cancer clusters, for instance, in West Cumbria. And me and Ian were talking yesterday actually about the impact of radiation on cardiovascular health, and I was reading actually something earlier where there's just been a a study that's identified that about 500,000 strokes a year have been caused by radiation. So a lot of people perhaps are not aware that in many ways this is a lot more insidious and a lot more damaging. And certainly when we look at Sellafield, as we know there's this massive legacy of contamination in West Cumbria and also in the Irish Sea. And that comes back to this legacy thing, which is what we're talking about really here, is nuclear waste. And the cost of dealing with nuclear waste. You know, a modern nuclear power station might be scheduled to operate for perhaps 60 years. So, you know, Sizewell B, for instance, that's the kind of estimate for that. But the actual legacy is that there's waste that lasts potentially hundreds of thousands of years that needs to be managed in some way. Now, the GDF is one proposal to manage that, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail, but the cost is enormous. There's an agency called the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority that's charged by the UK government with decommissioning nuclear power stations at their end of their operating life and managing the radioactive waste that results. And the latest estimate that they had was that just clearing up, closing and clearing up and dealing with waste from the existing power stations that we have would be £266 billion. Now bearing in mind that we are paying this as taxpayers, it's not the nuclear industry that really pays for this. And it's just a massive cost, and that's at current prices, so you know it's going to be a lot higher. Just going back to the Hinkley Point C example. So, you know, the more you have, the more it's going to cost you, and you're probably well aware that, you know, Boris Johnson originally proposed to triple nuclear power generation by 2050. That's recently been reinforced by the government publishing a nuclear roadmap, which basically gives a similar commitment. So you can imagine that the costs are going to exponentially rise for dealing with the resultant waste. The other issues are, I'll come back to that again in a moment, but the government talks a lot about nuclear power providing energy security, which is interesting because when you look at the proposals at the moment, the new plants that we've looked at and being built at Hinkley Point and proposed in development at Sizewell C are actually reliant on a French reactor design, one that's largely troubled and actually accident prone. The first one they installed at a place called Taishan 1 in China had an accident due to corrosion. It released some radioactive gas. It was closed for a long period of time. The Chinese authorities tried to cover up the accident. And it's also had problems elsewhere. You know, there was a reactor in Finland, for instance, that they built with the EPR. The first year when it was meant to be commissioned, it was basically almost offline all the time because parts failed. And when it actually was brought online, the irony was it's hardly operated since then because it's cheaper to actually produce power using hydroelectricity than it is using the nuclear power station. I was actually reading yesterday that even the Finnish authorities are questioning whether that plant was ever actually worth building in light of the cost issues. And the other thing with nuclear is it's very reliant on foreign money. So, you know, Hinkley Point C has been built with French taxpayer money in effect. The French will bring in money into Sizewell C. A lot of the other so-called the small modular reactors, which the government's looking at, a lot of them are foreign designs, foreign money. But they're also looking at, for instance, United Arab Emirates, sovereignty funds and things like that. And the other issue, which is a biggie, is the reliance on uranium. Because historically the uranium that's been used for powering Britain's nuclear reactors, which are actually operated by France, have actually been fueled by Russian uranium. So you've got this bizarre situation where energy security is reliant on a French company that uses Russian uranium to power its reactors, which is bizarre. Now, contrast this with, I was reading another source today, a recent report by Exeter University which identified that if you used 1% of Britain's land, that's 1% of the land when you take out all the high-grade agricultural land, all the national parks, all the sites of scientific interest, all the World Heritage sites. 1% of the land, if you use that for wind and solar power, you could completely power all the households in Britain. Now that is energy security, because you're not reliant on foreign technology, foreign money, and Russian uranium to do that. And in fact, the US Energy Secretary, Jennifer Grantham, she actually said in a conference in Sydney that no country can be held hostage if they're relying on the sun, the wind, the waves to power the nation. So that to me is real energy security, and things like that we need to look at. We also haven't, we're an island nation, we've hardly tapped into tidal and wave power. It just seems bizarre. And we also have massive potential power source in geothermal power once beneath our feet. We've got this huge legacy, we know that here in Cumbria, and certainly where I live in Lincolnshire we do. This massive legacy of coal mining, and there's things like mine heat water that you can actually draw on to bring energy. And even a parliamentary committee recently said that basically all the domestic heating needs of Britain's households could be met through tapping into geothermal power. So, do we want to spend £266 billion generating and managing more nuclear waste, or do we want to spend £266 billion on actually being energy secure through investment in that? But we don't even need to do that. The first thing we should be doing is making our homes better insulated and more energy efficient, because apparently £1 that you spend on energy efficiency saves you £7 in additional generating capacity that you have to build. So it's a fool's errand to constantly be chasing more and more power. We should be looking at demand management first. Just going back to this very quickly, the other thing that you'll be well aware of, given what's happening in Ukraine, is the fact that nuclear power stations represent a huge target for people who often talk about terrorists. But the biggie really now is state actors, because obviously nuclear power plants are likely to be a target for any hostile power, because it potentially, if you hit them with the right weaponry, they become a dirty bomb. So that's a big worry as well. And just one last thing, with the Hinkley Point C, I mentioned that that's being built by the French, and it's basically technically at their risk. So the longer it goes on and the more it costs, initially the French taxpayer will have to pick up the cost. But ultimately, obviously, the British people will pay for that through enhanced bills. But with the future nuclear power plants, the intention is to apply a different model, and effectively it's what they call a regulated asset-based model. And it actually means that what the government will do is impose a levy on every electricity consumer's bill, specifically to pay the nuclear industry. So the intention is to collect this money in and to pay the contractors that are building the nuclear power stations money as they go through the build process. And the intention is to de-risk it for them. But of course it costs us money. And ultimately they make the profits out of the electricity that's generated, and then they give us the waste back, and we have to pay to deal with that, and we have to pay to decommission the plants. So it's not a bad deal for them, but it ain't so great for us. Okay, so So, what's happening at the moment, as you'll be well aware, is that essentially nuclear waste that's produced is initially held on site at nuclear power stations in cooling ponds until the temperature is brought down to a point where it can be transported. And then essentially it's taken in special nuclear waste trains to Sellafield for long-term storage. And this is actually a waste train crossing the Arnside Viaduct. So that's the kind of current proposal. That's how it's dealt with presently. And in 1976, I need a reference for this. In 1976, Professor Flowers did a, is it on here? I bet I've lost some of my notes, you know. Professor Flowers produced a report, this Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, and essentially Professor Flowers said in that report that no nuclear plant should be built until such time as a long-term solution for the management of radioactive waste actually was formulated and put into place. So for a very long period of time there was a lot of debate about how waste should be dealt with, and certainly there's been a number of proposals over the years to bring nuclear waste to Cumbria and deposit it into a geological disposal facility. So far those proposals have been rebuffed, most recently in 2013 when the then leader of Cumbria County Council, Eddie Martin, after some considerable consideration and kind of on a road to Damascus really, because initially he was kind of in favour of it, and then completely after having studied the issue for some time determined that it wasn't the right solution for waste and for Cumbria, and decided that Cumbria County Council would no longer support the proposal, and then it basically was in effect ended. So most recently what's happened is there's an organisation called the Committee for Radioactive Waste Management, which effectively what they are is a advisory body to government on managing waste, radioactive waste. And their proposal was that a geological disposal facility, a deep repository for high-level waste, would be the most desirable solution. Now they did consider other bizarre things as well, like other things that were considered were freezing waste in ice flows, blasting it out into space, which was another interesting but fortunately discarded concept, because you can imagine the potential danger of that. And yeah, and in the past they've also dumped waste out to sea, and in fact there was a report that some of my predecessors did in nuclear free local authorities about the nasties that are in a place called the Beaufort Dyke, which is in the middle of the Irish Sea, which is absolutely horrendous. There's got tens of thousands of nuclear waste barrels and mustard gas and all sorts of horrible things that are in there. So, fortunately we've moved on a little bit from that, one would hope anyway. But we still haven't got this kind of solution in place, this proper solution, and they're hoping that this GDF will be the solution. So let's kind of have a look at that really. Certainly Sellafield, the people in Sellafield are very much wedded to the idea of a GDF, because I visited there last July and they couldn't wait to have it really. It was to them absolutely the solution. So, as I said, they had a look at the different methods, and what they concluded, basically what they concluded to explain in 2018 was within the present state of knowledge, the burial underground of between 200 and 1,000 metres below the surface of radioactive waste in a purpose-built facility with no intention to retrieve the waste once the facility is closed was the best available approach. And this conclusion is essentially what's driving government policy, and it's controversial and contested to this day. So, where are they looking? Oh, sorry. This is essentially what the GDF would look like, a representation. So, I should say what they are looking at, the government, is they're looking at essentially an offshore facility. So the idea would be to have a surface facility which is essentially the purple bit at the top, where waste trains, thank you Irene, waste trains, like would arrive on a regular basis with high-level heat-generating waste from Sellafield, essentially, initially. And what would happen would be, that would be unloaded, it would be inspected, it would be sent down tunnels into vaults beneath the seabed and out up to 22 kilometres from the coastline. What would happen, the period of building the facility, the estimate would be about 15 years altogether. I've heard there could be up to 24 kilometres of tunnels, and it could be at any distance between 200 and 1,000 metres underground. I think that the higher risk, the more heat generating waste would be lower, and also it has to be quite separated because of the fact it does generate this heat. So it would be taken to vaults, the vaults would be sealed, it would be kind of backfilled, and the idea would be eventually that it would be all filled up, the surface would be sealed off, the surface facility would be removed, the site would be cleared. That would be the intention. So it should be said there's no intention to retrieve any of this waste or to intervene with it at all once it's placed in the facility. So if there's an accident or it leaks, nobody will be looking to see that's happening, and nobody will be looking to intervene to stop it from happening. And it will just lie here in perpetuity. So the intention is it's not going to be taken out of the ground ever again, it's not going to be reused in any way, unless it's accidentally disturbed, and that's one of the worries that people have, that it will remain in situ and could potentially be disturbed in the future. But also, the intention is, you know, a lot of this stuff will take 100, 200,000 years to lose its radioactivity. Nobody has ever built a man-made structure that's actually lasted that length of time. So what is going to occur in that period of time? So that's kind of what the GDF is. Just let me check if there's anything else I need to say. I think Ian was going to reference the Sunday Telegraph article, weren't you?
I'll do that.
Yeah, okay, right. So I won't mention that then. But there was a very good Sunday Telegraph article about the GDF, which Ian will tell you about. Which I got quoted actually at the end. But yeah, that was a very good description. But it's basically a huge facility. Now the one on the right hand side, the other thing that people sometimes say, and the industry says, oh, there's loads of these, they're operating all over the place. There's 20 of them at least. Oh yeah, lots of them. The reality is there's only actually one that's actually being built in Finland. There's a pilot plant in France which isn't actually operational. There's a Finnish one that's nearing completion. There's lots and lots of them that are being studied and investigated and are in various points of being, you know, in contention. I mean, for instance, Marianne and I have been working with colleagues in Canada, in Ontario. There's 2 sites there, and local people there have just been polled about whether they want a nuclear waste dump on their doorstep. But they're not actually built. It's a bit like a lot of the other myths about nuclear power. You know, people talk about nuclear power plants and designs that they're kind of, you know, Rolls-Royce and all these other ones. That none of them are built. They're all just theoretical. None of them have even got any permission to operate. And none of them have got any sites to operate from. So you've got to really take a lot of these claims with very much a pinch of salt. So where are they looking for a potential site? Well, in Cumbria there's now 2 sites they're looking at. One is what's called the Mid-Copeland search area. So that includes the Sellafield site and roundabouts. One thing they have done now that's different from the original plans when they first looked at Cumbria as a potential location is they have excluded the Lake District National Park now. from consideration, which originally, believe it or not, they didn't, bizarrely. So this is one area they're looking at. So this is what's called the electoral ward of Gosforth. So it includes Seascale, Gosforth, Beckermet, Calderbridge, Hale, Thornhill, Nethertown and Greystones, apparently. So what they're doing is they're using the new ward boundaries for the Cumberland Council. And the other location that they're looking at is South Copeland. And as you can see from here, what is interesting is with the so-called South Copeland search area, most of it's actually excluded, because most of it's actually now National Park or going to be National Park extension. And in effect what it means is you've really only got two sites that they're looking at. It's either right at the very south of the area, the tip around Haverig, which is what this picture is, and Millen, or alternately round a place called Drigg, which is where the nuclear industry has a low-level waste repository at the moment. So that's where they store the low-level waste. So one of the potential sites is a former RAF base, now an open prison down in Haverig, and that was initially mentioned as a potential site in one of the very first documents and was swiftly pulled thereafter. But that actually is a potential site they're looking at. So that's the second one. And they have considered other sites as well. There was one in the north called Allerdale, the Allerdale area, but that was pulled because the geology was found to be unsuitable. And they also recently considered a site in East Yorkshire near Hull, a place called South Holderness, and that was also pulled. And why that was actually withdrawn was because of public objections. Effectively, the local residents were able to lobby the council to exercise something called the right to withdraw, and the council passed a resolution saying they didn't want to be part of the process, and it basically killed it off. Within about 3 weeks, the actual process there actually died a death. Now, elsewhere, there's also a site in Thedlethorpe in Lincolnshire which is under consideration, which is next to the seaside resort of Mablethorpe, and that's another one where they've identified a specific site. That's a former gas terminal that they're looking at there. So the procedure, the process is very, very protracted, in the sense there's a kind of investigation and consultation period before the government chooses an eventual site, and then thereafter there's an operational period before the facility is closed. So how it works is, essentially, for an area to be considered, somebody has to come forward and ask the nuclear industry to consider their area. Now, bizarrely, the government's published some guidance, which they published it shortly after that organisation called the Committee on Radioactive Waste Management made its decision that GDF was the right thing to do in 2018. Shortly after that, the government published some guidance. It was called Implementing Geological Disposal, Working with Communities. And essentially what they did, they asked the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, the people that manage waste and shut down nuclear plants, to manage this process of finding a site using this guidance. So the idea is the guidance is quite prescriptive and says exactly what stages it needs to go through. And it's essentially based on two things. What they say site selection is essentially based on two things. The site's got to have the right geology, and it's got to have a willing community. Now, the second bit is very contestable, and that's the bit I personally am most interested in terms of this process, to be honest. So, you know, it's meant to be science-based, consent-based. So the right geology to accommodate the waste and the facility that will pass a safety test and be approved by all the regulatory agencies. So they basically have to get approval from two agencies, the Office of Nuclear Regulation and the Environment Agency have to kind of approve the site. And they've got to have a willing community. Now what's interesting with the willing community, to determine its willingness, the community has to approve the proposal in what's called a test of public support. I'll come on to that in a bit, but that is, again, it's a very contentious concept, really. So the idea is that the whole process starts off with somebody saying to the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, well, it's their agency called Nuclear Waste Services, going to them and saying, I think you should take a look at our area. And this person is what's called, or agency can be, is what they call an interested party. Now what's interesting about the interested party is the interested party doesn't have to have any connection with the area. So I'll be honest with you, I have thought about, and I should have done this on April Fool's Day, I actually thought about nominating Rishi Sunak's Richmond constituency for a GDF, because this is how ludicrous it is that anybody can nominate an area to be a GDF, which is mad. To me, at least, the very least it should be is a local authority passing a resolution saying, let's go to NWS, Nuclear Waste Services, and express an interest. The process would then be transparent, local people would know it was happening right from the beginning, and there'd be some kind of accountability for that interested party as a council to take that forward. But here it can be anybody. So what's happened is you've had, for instance in Cumbria, one of the interested parties was a former manager at Sellafield, for instance. We've had other people have had land interests that have nominated themselves, the area that they live in, and we've had, in one case it was a charity, a local charity. So not only can it be, they're basically faceless and have no connection with the area, but they might actually have a financial interest in pursuing a GDF in the area as well. So that's one of the big things that I really find objectionable about the start of the process is there's no accountability and it's completely anonymous. Now in some of the other areas, I mentioned South Holderness where they've recently decided to withdraw from this process. What happened there was apparently some of the officers at the local council decided to go to Nuclear Waste Services and say, why don't you come and have a look at our area, and didn't bother telling any of the councillors they work for, which not surprisingly made them very upset, and they decided at the next council meeting to pass a resolution almost unanimously pulling out of the process. So it was really very well, badly thought out, the whole thing there. But, the idea is they contact the Nuclear Waste Services. What then happens is the Nuclear Waste Services people go to the local councils and say, would you be interested in helping us to set up what's called a working group? And if the local council approves that, what happens then is a working group is set up, and Nuclear Waste Services decides to cherry pick a few people from the local community that they think represents that community to put onto this working group to kickstart the process. Now sometimes local people only hear about this when the working group's set up. So in Fedalthorpe in Lincolnshire, the way they found out was when BBC Lincolnshire radio actually broadcast something to say, hey guys, somebody's bringing a nuclear waste dump to this area and your council's been in a discussion with them for 2 years, didn't bother to tell you. Not surprisingly, they were a bit upset. So the idea is they set up this working group, and then there's a process of consultation that's carried out. So normally what happens is that there's a roadshow that's taken around telling people what the nuclear waste dump's going to be about and how it's going to work. And then eventually what happens is they form something a bit more formal called a community partnership. And that generally has representatives from all of the local councils on it. And it will usually have perhaps representatives from the business community, local charities, some cases tourism, some cases farming. They might have a young person on there as well. So it's meant to be more representative of the community. But one of the issues has been that although they have these road shows and they publish lots of glossy newsletters and have a website, the meetings have been very, very obscure. It's been very hard to access information about what they do, to access papers or minutes. A lot of the community partnerships haven't had public meetings, so the public haven't been able to go along and challenge them, ask them questions. They've not been filming the meetings like we are, so people can see them later on. So there hasn't really been any accountability. One of the other things that's been pretty outrageous is that when the working groups were set up, they appointed so-called interim independent chairs to sit on them, and a lot of them have been paid enormous amounts of money for the services. You know, in Thorpe, the chair there got initially £1,000 a day for doing the job. In South Holderness, the agency that employed the chair was going to be paid £1,350 a day. Just massive amounts of money that bore no relationship to what ordinary people in those areas would earn. You know, in Thorpe, the chair now earns, or is paid, I should say, would be a better way of putting it, is paid £750 a day, which is about 6 times the average wage in the area. So, you know, it's a massive disconnect, really, between how they operate and ordinary people in the community. So, very little kind of real access to what they do, very little accountability. And the community partnerships themselves, although they're meant to kind of drive the process, they don't really have that much power. A lot of what goes on is carried out by nuclear waste services. They have the money. They're the constituted body that has to buy in any advice that anybody wants. If they want to do any surveys or polling of public opinion, it's nuclear waste services that do that and pay for it. So it's very much them calling the tune. And you could argue that community partnerships to a large degree are window dressing. Also, some of the people who have been appointed to the community partnerships, again, have had some unwanted connections. So Allerdale, which now isn't going ahead, that had 3 people on it that were connected to the nuclear industry. One of them actually owned a big business in the area, probably stood to make quite a lot of money if a GDF was brought to his area. I challenge this. It's just wrong, really. And the other thing is, when people do send questions to them, they tend to get fielded out to nuclear waste services. It's not actually the community partnership that generally answers them. They've had some mysterious PO box number in South Wales that they've been using that's nowhere near any of the areas under consideration. So that's what they do with the community partnerships. But what's also happening, as well as sort of having that body and consulting people at these regular roadshows, is they've also been doing site investigations. So in Cumbria we've had seismic investigations, essentially sandblasting the ocean to test the geology beneath the seabed and the impact that's had on marine life. They do ecology surveys of wildlife, for instance, is one of the other things. Obviously, geology surveys. The big thing that they do in a later stage if an area is taken forward is they dig boreholes, deep boreholes to take rock samples. And to sweeten this up, the deal up for local people, the other thing they do is have a community investment fund that's managed by the community partnership. So the idea is Mid-Copeland, South Copeland, organisations there can apply for funding from this community investment fund to provide services or facilities that are meant to be of benefit to the people in the search area. So initially they get £1 million a year to actually disperse as funding, and then if they start to dig boreholes at a later stage, that goes up to £2.5 million a year. So you know it's a sum that could potentially sway some communities and some people to support the process going forward. So they reckon it's going to take between 15 and 20 years to actually come to a point where they are about to select a site. And then what would eventually happen would be that if an area got through the borehole testing and the other testing, they would conduct something called a test of public support. So what happens there is the local councils that have endorsed the process, that have been involved in the process, what they call a relevant principal local authority, they decide when the test is held, but it's actually the community partnership that decides what type of test it will be. Now, the nuclear-free local authorities have always been adamant we want to see a referendum, essentially, as a test, but it's not certain, it's not cast in stone what the test will be, so it's possible that they might decide on sampling, they might decide on more public consultations. It's not beyond the realms of possibility, they might even decide to just ask councillors to have a vote and determine that to be the test of public support. Because one of the things they've always said, nuclear waste services, is communities can withdraw at any point of the process. Now, I'll tell you now that is a total lie, because communities cannot withdraw from the process. There's only two bodies can withdraw from the process. Nuclear waste services can withdraw from the process, like they did in Allerdale, because they felt the geology wasn't suitable, or the councils themselves can withdraw from the process, which in this case is Cumberland Council. And that's the only two circumstances in which you can withdraw. Because what sometimes happens is nuclear waste services say, well, it's going well, isn't it? Nobody wants to withdraw yet. Well, no, because they can't. It's basically wrong to say that. We've kind of challenged them to actually say that's the case. So they get to site selection, there's a test of public support. The idea is if a majority, whatever that is, of the potential host community, we don't know what that is either, it's not clear from the guidelines. If it is then approved, what then happens is they have to go through a regulatory process of getting approvals from the Office of Nuclear Regulation, the Environment Agency, they've got to do planning, etc, etc, etc. There's a construction period, possibly 15 years, and then there's an operational period, which is basically, well, they said originally it would be 100 years that would be accepting waste, but really it's going to be more like 150 years, 160 years before it finishes its job. And then the intention is to close the site and, as I say, to landscape it. Now, one of the big sells of this is nuclear waste services will say, well, look, it's going to bring loads of money into your area, you know, you're going to get all this money up to the time it's selected, and then when it starts, you're going to get loads of jobs, because there'll be all these construction jobs. Nonsense. I don't believe that for a single second. The reason why I don't believe that is at Hinkley Point C, the same promises were made. What happened there was simply that the contractors brought in all their own specialist labour forces. They brought in migrant workers from other parts of the country that are working on big civil engineering projects, and what they've done is put them into accommodation specifically for those workers, and what they do is they work Monday, Friday or whatever, then they go back to the accommodation, at some point they go back to their families. There's actually been very little trickle down to the local economy, very few people have been employed. Where there have been local employees, they've been mainly in the very lowest level jobs rather than anything significant. In terms of the operational phase, yeah, they're saying 500 people. We don't really know. There's been other quotes of 200 people operating the site. Again, there probably would be some local people working on the site, but I suspect in the case of Cumbria, what would be more likely is a lot of the people would simply be moved from Sellafield to the site, because they are going to be displacing workers if they set up a GDF. So I very much suspect they'll just simply move workers across. Now obviously if those workers live in these search areas, that will have no impact in terms of the job market, but it's not likely to create that many additional jobs. The big worry in South Copeland is it's on the Haverick site, is that could lead to the closure of the prison. Now, whilst you might not want to see a prison in your area, there's likely to be people employed at that prison from that local area, so you are likely to lose those jobs. And the other worry, of course, is the impact on tourism, because who wants to come to, you know, holiday on a nuclear waste coast? I don't know where it is, that poster, but you've got a good one about, I think it's probably one in there, about, you know, Millen being the, you know, Britain's first nuclear waste dump site. So, you know, that is a big worry. And, you know, in Thedlethorpe in Lincolnshire, if you've been to Mablethorpe, Mablethorpe's a big coastal seaside resort on Lincolnshire. 400,000 people a year visit that site. And they estimate in that part of the world about 9,000 jobs are sustained from tourism. So imagine, you know, if you're going to lose a fraction of those jobs, even 10%, it's an awful lot more than 500 posts that you're going to get in. So that's the big worry, really. That, you know, economic growth is going to go maybe that way rather than that way on that chart. So there's a lot to think about there. I know I've kind of overrun a little bit. But what I just wanted to end with is a little bit about information. So I've put these on your chair. So there's a number of websites if you want to find out a bit more about the GDF, because these are all very useful websites for checking out information about GDF. I know that Ian's got some stuff about GDF on his website as well. But I thought I'd put Ian's website as well for more general information about radiation. If anybody's interested in finding out more about what's happening in West Cumbria and wants to get involved, then please, you know, contact us via those websites or speak to us at the end of the meeting. And if anybody is a councillor or from a local council interested in looking at joining nuclear-free local authorities, please feel free to contact me on that email address. Thank you very much for your patience. And we will take it.
Thanks very much, Mary Ann, for inviting me to give this talk. One thing I'd like to say about the good talk that Richard gave us, that it may seem about the whole process is well thought out and orderly. Now, that process actually was brought together by Richard, not the government. He put it together to be able to understand what was going on. Seriously, so we all have a great vote of thanks for explaining what's actually happening, because the government's not explaining it, it's Richard who's telling it. Okay, next slide, please. So what I'm going to discuss today is the government's proposals for deep disposal in Cumbria. Secondly, I'll be discussing my area of expertise is that I'm a radiation biologist, so I'm going to frighten everybody by discussing radioactivity and the nuclear waste, in particular various radionuclides, but specific ones. Discuss very, very briefly what the IRX inquiry did back in 1996, you know, it's a long time ago, it's 30 years, almost 30 years ago, and make a few conclusions. Next slide. Well, nuclear waste in Cumbria. Well, but the thing is that there are no, put it this way, a lot of scientists would like to get to grips with what the government is proposing, so that they can, technically speaking, so that they can criticise it. It's not, nothing been published. I mean, basically in 2018, Coram, they were the last people to look at it 6 years ago. Since then, there's been, technically speaking, there's been nothing. There's been no specific proposals by the government, and nothing in the party manifestos, either Labour or Tory. There's been no green paper or white paper, just various statements by government departments saying a government spokesman stated. Quite a few times during Richard's talk he said that a lot of stuff has been happening. It's just frankly undemocratic. It's unfair, and well, I totally agree with that. In other words, what basically happened is the government shuffling along with nuclear waste, trying to dampen down any opposition by not putting any proposals up, specific proposals that we can get to grips with. Next slide. Except for on May the 6th, last Monday, suddenly there was this long article in the Daily Telegraph. By the way, I often call it the Daily Tory graph. But it's amazing, this long article with a headline, "Undersea Nuclear Graveyard Now More Costly Than HS2." And the peg that we're putting this on was the fact that there's been a lot of opposition to HS2 because it's extremely expensive, and the government finally chopped part of it. And I'll let you read it. Basically, this is the strapline, is that a vast subsea nuclear graveyard has been planned to hold Britain's burgeoning piles of radioactive waste. The biggest, longest lasting and most expensive infrastructure project ever undertaken in the UK. Finally, somebody has come out in a major newspaper and said, this is actually what's happening. Wow, we were all knocked back by that. And the journalist, a guy called Jonathan Leake, is a funny character, but credit to him that he actually put it on the front page of a major national newspaper. So I'm going to discuss it now. Okay, next slide. From that, the Telegraph article, we can now get an idea of what the government is proposing. They're going to excavate 36 square kilometres, that's 6 by 6 kilometres of rock, to create a massive underground cavern, the biggest ever in the world. They say it's going to take more than 150 years to do this. And it's going to cost, just excavating it, going to cost they say 66 billion. Well, these are according to the latest estimates from scientists at the Nuclear Waste Services, which is a government-owned company designing the project, which you mentioned. It's actually an agency of the NDA. Now, funny enough, the NDA, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, is now here it's not decommissioning, it's now actually involved in nuclear projects. And it was doing something that, or facilitating nuclear projects, something it was designed not to do when it was first set up about 20 years ago. Okay, next slide. So what is the government proposing to do? Well, it's proposing to dump high-level wastes and used nuclear fuel in this repository, which now that is really serious stuff. Why is it serious? Because it's heat generating. It's not a little bit of heat that you can switch off. No, this is perpetual heat coming out from the radioactive decay of the huge amounts of radionuclides which are in the waste. It's the kind of things that caused the problems, for example, with Chernobyl and Fukushima. You couldn't switch off the heat. So, in both cases, the reactors exploded. So, when you say this is heat generated, that is really serious matter. To give it an idea, if you put the nuclear waste in an area which is very wet, and you keep a heat source pumping heat in all the time, you can't switch it off, remember, what happens when you heat water? Well, a child will tell you that it creates steam. And what happens with steam, again, a child will tell you you have explosions. Now that's the real problem. That's the real nitty-gritty bit of dealing with radioactive waste. How the hell do you put these radioactive waste underground, which is wet, causing steam explosion, keep it from steam explosions? Well, it's very difficult indeed. Very difficult and very expensive. Secondly, we're talking about a hellish mixture, and I use that adjective advisedly, of radionuclides. I'll come back to that in a minute. Many of these radionuclides last for millions of years. Say plutonium-239, half-life of 20,000 years. A rule of thumb is you take 10 half-lives, so 10 times 20,000 or 24,000 years, a quarter of a million years. That's how long you have to keep it safe. Well, a quarter of a million years, I mean, come on. How long is recorded human history? Maybe about 10,000 years, starting from 8,000 BC. That's when recorded human history starts, basically. And here we are talking glibly about monitoring this stuff for millions of years. I mean, just crazy, really. From the article, we learned that they're talking about 10,000 tons, we know that about 10,000 tons a year of used fuel is produced globally, of which there are about 500 tons in the UK. Plus, about 800,000 tons of cubic meters of intermediate level waste here in Britain. Plus, even more low-level wastes in Drake. The difference between high-level waste, HLW, which is HLW, and ILW and LLW, sorry about throwing these acronyms at you, is the level of waste, the level of radioactivity in the waste. Right? But the most important by far are the heat-generating ones, which is the high-level waste and the used nuclear fuel. Okay, next slide. Now this is the periodic table, which some of you may know about, and the ones in colour that I'm highlighting here are all the radionuclides which are in used nuclear fuel. You can see, there's a heck of a number of them. They are activation products, some are fission and activation products, and the circle ones are the ones that are long-lasting after millions of years. Basically, it's a hellish brew of radionuclides. It's a serious problem, really is. That's why nuclear people who are opposed to nuclear waste, like myself and many of my colleagues, we're trying to get to grips with what the government's going to do about this. And it's very difficult. It's like nailing an octopus to the wall. You just slithers all over the place with this government. Next slide. Okay, radionuclides. Why am I so worried about them? Well, they're highly radiotoxic, particularly uranium and plutonium. Radiotoxic, that means if it gets inside you, you die. Okay, that's toxicity. Another point is that they're highly mobile in the environment. Iodines, chlorines, and selenium, they're very long-lived. Millions of years in some cases. For example, iodine-129, 15.7 million years is the time it takes for an original amount to decay by half. These are eye-watering figures. But the government doesn't want people to know about this or worry about it. And what Marion and I and Richard think, yes, people do want to know about it and worry about it. In addition to that, not only mobile, but some of them are gases, which contain carbon-14. For example, carbon dioxide and methane, and also tritium, which is the radioactive form. Hydrogen, which comes out in the form of radioactive water, or water vapor. Now that means not something in the water which is radioactive, but the water molecules themselves, which is radioactive. That should really worry you. So the overall whole conclusion is that this witch's brew of radionuclides is very dangerous to humans. We have to look at it very seriously. Next slide. Okay, radiation and health. This is my area. Just very quickly, radionuclides emit. Why are they so dangerous? It's because they emit alpha radiation, beta radiation, and gamma radiation. And in body cells, somatic cells, these cause cancers and cardiovascular diseases and strokes. And in germ cells like eggs and sperm, it causes genetic damage, so the next generation gets it. So that's the danger of radiation. And how does the radiation come out? By both external radiation and also internal radiation. For example, if you breathe in radioactive air or radioactive gases, or you drink contaminated water, or you drink contaminated radioactive food, you are irradiated from inside yourself, and that is by far the more dangerous of the two. There's also another problem, is that if you release radioactivity, say, into water, is that the benthic organizations will become contaminated. It's eaten by worms, which are contaminated, which are eaten by little fishes. Big fishes eat the little fishes. We eat the fish, so you have bioaccumulation. That is well known to occur. Next slide. So, you're going to ask, well, is this a problem, Ian? Yes, it is. For example, right this very minute, the radioactivity levels in Cumbria and Whitehaven's harbour are, roughly speaking, about 30 becquerels per kilogram. What does that mean? It means 30 nuclear disintegrations per second. That's the rate of radioactive decay. So 30 is quite a large number. And this is of americium-241 and 10 becquerels per kilogram of cesium. That's in Whitehaven still now. Now the thing is that these radioactive shouldn't be there. They're man-made. In other words, we're having contamination. Where does it come from? It comes from Sellafield, which is 15 kilometers south of Whitehaven. It's come up. But thank goodness reprocessing has stopped at Sellafield. God, it took them long enough to stop it. So that means that basically the source of contamination for the time being is stopped. But nevertheless, it's still a problem. At Whitehaven Harbour, you've still got radioactive contamination. In other words, people are living in a contaminated environment. That's not very good. What kind of effect is that going to have on tourism to Cumbria? Oh, God knows. Anyway, next slide. So, very, very briefly, talk about what on earth is americium-241. It's an alpha emitter and a gamma ray emitter with a relatively long half-life of 432 years. It's nasty stuff. And it's not just me that says it's nasty stuff. This is from the standard US college textbook. That's the name of it. 73rd edition, published in 1992. This is what it says. Americium-241 is both extremely toxic and radioactive. There are serious health concerns for the ingestion of alpha emitters. And americium is also chemically toxic in the form of heavy metal toxicity. In other words, you can have very dangerous chemicals like, for example, lead or niobium, things like that, cadmium, which are very bad for you. Americium is also chemically very toxic. So it's a double whammy, both radioactive and chemically, which is going to get you. We shouldn't have americium in the harbour at Whitehaven. Next slide. And that's going on to cesium. If anything, it's more dangerous. It's a fission product from nuclear power stations. It's both a gamma and beta in there, because it has a double decay. It's a 30-year half-life, and it's also very dangerous nuclide. Why? Because it's soluble, volatile. It's a noja emitter, which means, technical term means that when it decays, there are a lot of very low energy electrons coming from the nucleus, from the shells round about. And it also comes with cesium-134. So if you've got cesium-137, you've also got cesium-134. And 134 is actually even more dangerous than 137 in many ways. There's a bloke called Bandashevsky who says that the maximum concentration should be 5, in humans, should be 5 becquerels per kilogram. That's a low figure. And already we've seen in higher levels than that at Whitehaven. Next slide. Okay, this geological disposal. Well, I'm covering some of the same ground that Richard has, but there's been research since the 60s, even before that, the 50s. It's not fully implemented anywhere in the world. Excavation, 2 kilograms underground, big question mark. These are we've already been through the science that was Richard: siding, construction, waste, encapsulation, replacement, sealing, and closure. Take it about 100 years or so, maybe even more, massive costs. So big question marks. Next slide. Here are the problems. The area must be right, i.e. the geology must be right. Secondly, the encapsulation must be right. And there's the technology. What do you put them in? Copper containers, stainless steel containers. What are the overpacks? What about the bentonite going on? And fill them up. It must be politically acceptable, politics. There's a huge cost. And there are, let me tell you, there are many remaining scientific uncertainties here. We're still, honestly, at square one in many of the problems. Effectively, what we're doing is we're passing these problems on to future generations. Morally, it really reeks. I mean, nuclear power is it's just about the most morally contestable of all of man's activities. Nuclear power, nuclear weapons, perhaps more so. Okay, next slide. And this is a graphic slide to explain what I'm talking about. You have the contamination source, and you have various pathways to human beings of how there could be contamination. So that's why we need to worry about it here in Cumbria. Next slide. Very briefly about the NIREX inquiry back, 30 years ago now. This is the report, the inspector's report. Indications are overwhelmingly that the site is not suitable. The whole of Cumbria is not suitable. And on this basis, there's no national or regional benefit to be gained for continuing investigations. But here's the government doing it all over again. They don't learn. Next slide. This is a slide that I made. I'm sorry for the... But basically, this is the sea, and this is the seabed, and of course, you have the mountains of Cumbria here. Okay, it's a cross-section across Cumbria. But you have these massive downflows of water from the hills, from the mountains. There's hydraulic pressure forcing the water down into here. And this is if you have nuclear waste down here, this water will enter this huge cavern, for sure. You may say, Ian, are you a geologist? I am not a geologist. However, I'm a good friend with a retired geological professor who is very good. And I've ran these slides past him. And he said, this is David Smythe, the professor, and he said, yeah, you're right, this is exactly the problem. In other words, they said this was all decided back in 1996. Basically, the government haven't learned a single lesson. They said, you don't put the waste here, it doesn't matter whether it's under Cumbria or under the sea, still the geology is lousy. Next slide. I said another reason is that there's massive fracturing in Cumbria. That's one of the big reasons why the NIREX inquiry failed. It's because even if you were to put the fuel down here, you have many fractures. And this will result in, or could result in the radioactive waste reaching the surface. In other words, it's not ideal. You don't want fractured areas like this. You need better geology. And Cumbria is not good geology. Oops. This slide comes from Stuart Hazelton. Right, conclusions. Yeah. Any deep waste repository in Cumbria would pose future risk. Any. It's just a rotten site. And I've and this is me saying, you know, councillors have a moral and legal obligation to consider the evidence on geology. They're not doing that right now in Millom and the area around about Whitehaven. They're blind, they don't want to know, basically. But councillors have a moral duty to look at it. And secondly, councils have a moral legal obligation to reject the government's waste plans. Well, we'll see what happens. Okay, I'm going to finish off with a couple of nice slides. These are the key messages that we need to get to the government. Firstly, that the nuclear wastes are very problematic for a number of reasons. But the first step, surely, is to stop making more of it. We've got a big problem with waste? Right, okay, we acknowledge that. Okay, let's stop making more of it. Well, of course the government is actually making more of it, wants to make more of it. Many Cumbrians want radioactive waste even less than the government does. Right? The government is desperate for nuclear waste to be dumped here, but Cumbrians say, no, we want it even less than you. And I like the slogan, don't waste Cumbria. That's the great thing. In the future, we have all our publications will be "Don't Waste Cumbria." Encapsulate it nicely. Okay, a couple of more slides and then we'll finish. Thanks to both to Hazelstein and Smythe, friends, about because I ran everything by them and they said, yeah, you're right, absolutely right. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I like ending my talk to give you some heartwarming information, I guess. To make quotations by famous people which encapsulate what we really mean. Cicero was a Roman consul 2,000 years ago. He's a good egg, good guy. Boris Johnson prides himself on his classes. He doesn't know a squat about Cicero. If he did, he would probably be frightened by what he said. He said, and for those Latin scholars, he said, "Salus populi suprema lex esto." I took 4 years of Latin, so I'm allowed to say it. And what does that mean? It means the health and safety of the people is the supreme law. Whoa. Think about that. Richie Sunak, put that in your breakfast cereal in the morning. Really? It's the supreme law. Not that the economic benefits is the supreme law, but the health and safety of the people are. That's really good. And you may think, hey, Ian, you just dragged this up, you know. It's not really relevant. This slogan is plastered over many buildings throughout the world, including that. The Old Bailey, for example. I've seen it myself. The United States Capitol building. A rotunda of the National Bibliothèque in Paris. Many state government buildings in the United States. The Capitol building of Ottawa, Canada. It's all over the world. And Australia and New Zealand as well. It's not just me dreaming up these words. They are emblazoned on many, many public buildings. Right, let's hold their feet up to the toast, okay? So, if Cicero said it, it's good enough for him, it's good enough for us. And so we start off health and safety of the people first, mate. Next slide. Here's somebody else. This guy, Michael Attia. He's an all-round good egg. Great guy. He's no longer with us. He died in 2019. He was president of the Royal Society, Order of Merit. You can't get much higher than that. Next bit higher is royalty, basically. Order of Merit, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the Royal Society for Engineering. Oh, God. He's got so many qualifications as long as your arm, basically. There he is there, this guy. His main claim to fame is that he was chairman of the Audit Commission for many years, the Government's Audit Commission. Now, this is what he said in November 1995. Now, let me read it. I'll read it. He said, "I believe history will show that the insistence of a UK nuclear capability," and he broke off and said, "both weapons and energy," was fundamentally misguided. A total waste of resources and a significant factor in our Britain's relative economic decline over the past 50 years. Hey, I'll go along with that. That's exactly, if he says that's what's happened, and he's in a very good position being in the Audit Commission for so long to actually say that. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're being led down the garden path the wrong way. And the nuclear power and nuclear energy have not been a good thing, they've been a really bad thing. And I'll stop there. Next slide. Great. Next one? Yeah, thank you. Want to do questions quickly? Yeah?
Yeah.
Because I know there's questions also for people ask Richard, so I'll allow people to ask questions like me.
What's the name of the journalist?
Yeah?
Jonathan Lee,
Sorry, do you want to put the light on, please?
That's what I said.
Yeah?
I'm a bit relatively ignorant on these things, but what would your advice be to what to do with the existing nuclear place?
Well, I answered it partly one. It's really difficult. It's very problematic. First step, stop making money.
Oh yes, I agree with that.
The thing is that if they cannot stop making more, then why should we talk to you, to the government? And I'll say that to the government, and I'm going to give you. Why should we talk to you if you don't take the basic precautionary step by stopping more?
Okay.
So, there was, I know I'm avoiding the question. What would I do? It's tricky. Okay, here's what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't put it in the sea. I wouldn't put it, blast it off into space. Oh, God. It costs something like about $17 million to send 1 kilo of anything into space. That's the payload problem. Really, really expensive. That's one thing. But there have been many, many instances of satellites going adrift, going awry and falling back to Earth again. Can you imagine having nuclear waste coming through the atmosphere and being incinerated in the upper atmosphere because it burns when it goes back and being distributed all over the UK? Yeah, that's something you bear thinking about. What else? So not that. Well, I would say that we should really conduct studies about putting it into very thick metal containers. The trouble is that we did try that already, or the Swedes tried it with copper containers, which were about 4 inches thick all around. And they did some exploratory studies, and guess what? It didn't work. There was leaking. Even with 4 inches of corrosion, even with 4 inches of copper, oh God. So I don't have any real answers.
Excuse me, I did one of these installations, and one of the versions had they did a big competition globally to get artists and other people to develop something where people 100,000 years on would understand where a GDF was.
Oh, yes, that's a good one.
And that was a really good one. They had all sorts of, cats that turned purple, spiky things, really irrelevant things because they would all disappear. The language would be understood because we all know it changes. People would not comprehend. How would you do it? Well, I read this. I don't know if it's a fantasy, but it was a thing called, they found these geobacters, which were microorganisms, believe this, that would be inside with the GDF, and they would grow and start consuming the waste, nuclear waste. So it was a part of a research that they're doing, and then on my piece of work, I said I put 100,000 years and all these objects suddenly appeared because they've grown, and I said, are these friend or foe? Because these microorganisms have grown into something feeding on nuclear waste. But it sounds like science fiction, but it's a real research. But I'm not sure, maybe I was duped. I think I might be, because it sounds too fantastic.
I mean, there is a boundary between science fiction and science fact.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with such massive time frames and such massive amounts, and this sheer lack of knowledge on our part. I think human imagination, well, there have been quite a few science fiction stories about which conjecture what may happen with this. I mean, they're all as good as anybody else's, but they basically. I'm not really sure to what extent they're helping us here now. It's very difficult because you get to a point where we were talking about moral philosophies here. We're getting to the point where you shake your head saying, what on earth are we doing this thing for? Somebody said that they're going to ask me a question about why are we doing this? I think I'm going to try and tackle.
Why is it a trough for the nuclear industry and nuclear dream, really? Why is it bottomless? Why is there so much money that's available? We can't.
Irene gave me notice of this question, so I've been thinking about it, okay? I know there's why are we doing this? And basically, it's nuclear weapons. In other words, you probably don't know this, but the raw material, the fissile material for making nuclear weapons comes from, guess where? Civil nuclear power stations. In particular, if you take the tritium that you need, it's a reflector for making hydrogen bombs, where does that come from? Nuclear reactors. And also, of the facility, if you take uranium-238 and uranium-235, and plutonium-239, all fissile, well, 235 is fissile, and 239, plutonium is fissile. Where do they come from? Inside nuclear reactors. Bingo. So you need to have the nuclear reactors to get the raw materials, but also you need the expertise, the technology, the know-how. And what's happening is that nuclear power has such a bad reputation. Is that many young people are not going into the industry, and there's a real severe crisis in the nuclear industry about the fact that they can't get any staff. Young people just go on and off, particularly women. Not so much in France, funnily enough, which is their nuclear is a religion. It really is. I won't go there right now. But here in Britain, no. So there are severe problems. But so the government, however, there was the joint military chiefs of staff and the top diplomats, all these nice men who are in the Garrick Club, right? Remember, 40% of them voted to keep women out. They feel very strongly about the fact that Britain needs to be have its own nuclear power, have its own nuclear weapons. Bevan, the Labour politician, famously said, we want nuclear weapons to have a great big bloody Union Jack on it. And I'm not making this up, that's exactly what he said. In other words, they feel, no, this is nationalism, this is really us being a big nation. No, we're not. We should really be, for example, you take all the rest of the countries in Europe, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Spain, Italy, Portugal, they don't have nuclear weapons. So I mean, really, we don't really need nuclear weapons at all. But you may say, Ian, you would say that because I'm Vice President of CMD. But yes, that's true. And I am very closely connected with and do work for CMD. But we don't need nuclear weapons. And we're straying off the topic here for nuclear waste. But nevertheless, the point being that here's another thing: is that 93 countries have signed a thing called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. 93 nations. 94, I think, just recently, as another one. So, well, why don't we sign it? Yeah. And I'll just finish off by saying this. The United Nations has a very good track record of taking really horrible stuff like landmines or nasty chemicals, genetically modified foods, and banning them. And it's now decided it's going to ban nuclear weapons as well. And it's true that those countries who do have nuclear weapons have not signed it, including our country. But, hey, it's coming. Maybe even in my lifetime, we'll get to the situation whereby it will apply to those countries, even Britain, who decide, no, we're not going to have nuclear weapons. Anyway, we're a bit off.
Could I just respond to this gentleman's question as well? Just to explain what the Nuclear Free Local Authority's position is on the treatment of nuclear waste. I mean, obviously, I totally concur with Ian's point that we shouldn't produce it anymore, but essentially what our position is that the waste should be held on site and near surface and managed in special facilities and basically be subject to continual professional management and monitoring.
Yeah.
And then we certainly should be able to retrieve it if there's an accident and repackage it. One of the issues with this GDF, there's a couple of issues, particularly with GDF I've not mentioned. One is, if you don't have people doing that management, you lose those skills. So if you have accidents in the future, there's nobody able to respond, even assuming they can read any of the language that's associated with it. And the other worry I've got is with the GDF is that it gives the nuclear industry carte blanche to produce more waste, because what they say, it's like carbon capture. That's exactly the same. Carbon capture. Fossil fuel producers just say, I don't have to worry about it, we can just carbon capture it. The same with nuclear power. They'll basically say, look, we've got a solution, we'll just stick it under the ground, under the sea, seal it, or we can produce some more and just build another one if we need to. And in fact, there has been talk about having 2 GDFs potentially because of this idea of tripling nuclear power generation. The other point I wanted to make about it as well is, what does annoy me, I forgot to mention it earlier, is the fact that the polluter doesn't pay in the case of nuclear power. I kind of obliquely referenced it, but, for instance, EDF Energy, it only pays something like £20 million a year to something called the Nuclear Liabilities Fund. And the Nuclear Liabilities Fund is a kind of ring-fenced, kind of semi-independent pot of money that is used to decommission nuclear plants. Well, £20 million is a drop in the ocean compared to the cost of actually carrying out that work, because the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency currently draws about £2.5 billion a year to actually carry out its work. So if they're only paying 20 million, guess where the rest of it comes from? Well, it's essentially us as taxpayers. All right, some of it's invested, it makes small amounts of money. The irony is most of it's actually invested with the government, so it actually doesn't get very much money back into itself. But the bulk of the cost actually comes from taxpayers, and that's one thing I think that should happen with future power plants, is basically that the generator should have to provide for suitable accommodation, management, long-term for the waste they generate from their operations, and they should pay for it. We shouldn't be paying for it. They're making the profits off it while the thing's being generating electricity. That's something that really annoys me. I just think it's fundamentally wrong.
What's the CO2 on nuclear?
What's the CO2?
Yeah.
I can't give you exact figures. You mean per unit of electricity to generate it?
All this energy that nuclear produce, are we in the green or the red?
Well, I think when you look at
nuclear in the first place, do you see what I mean? They say that it's clean energy, green energy, and all that.
Sure.
So I'm just wondering, if we didn't have a nuclear system in the first place, would we have less CO2? In other words, if nuclear produces more CO2 than the energy, is it worth it?
Right, right. I think when you're looking at the CO2 footprint of nuclear power, you've got to look at the whole life cycle of it.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously one of the things that's said is it's a net zero generation method, that it doesn't generate any CO2 when it's actually operating. But you've got to think of the whole life cycle. So you've got the process of uranium mining, then you've got the processing into fuel, transportation, the construction of nuclear power plants, which is absolutely a massive carbon footprint. You look at Hinkley Point C, it's basically the biggest civil engineering project in Europe. They're now looking at having 15,000 workers working on that site. So within that carbon footprint, there's all these things like labour movement of supplies, and then when the thing actually operates, even then it's not strictly speaking net zero, because you've obviously still got to refuel it. There's a constant movement of personnel onto and off site that all have a carbon footprint. There's regular maintenance, there's shutdowns, and then at the end of the life cycle and the operating period, you've then got this period of decommissioning, which takes tens of years to complete, which is massively intensely carbon burning. And then the waste management comes on top of that, which is also massively intensive as well. And then the other thing to bear in mind is, in extreme circumstances, you have an accident, then that is incalculable really in terms of what the CO2 emissions of that would be, I would imagine. But you compare it to other forms of energy production, which is much more benign. You don't have a lot of those associated CO2 costs with the operation of things like solar panels, wind turbines, and certainly things like wave generation. There's something else I wanted to say in terms of that as well. I can't think what it was. Sorry. Come back to me.
There's been a number of studies, and these are now about 5 years old, that what they showed, they compared life cycle analysis for gas, oil, nuclear and coal. And basically you take everything into account, all the processes involved for those four. And then I'm cutting a sort of long story short. Basically, and the renewables came in at, roughly speaking, about 10 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour, okay? Just remember the number 10, okay? The rest of these same. That's for the renewables. For nuclear, it was 280, 10 to 280. For gas, it was 440, and coal, 1,000. So 10, 280, 400, 1,000. So therefore we go for nuclear? No. So is the coal
Go for the renewables.
Is the coal mine the GDF? Is two
Sorry, the trouble is, we're in that, you cannot hear what you're saying.
It's a coal mine of GDF. The nuclear waste services have said specifically that the coal mine site was excluded from consideration for a GDF. Whether you believe that is another matter.
I'm getting very hungry, and it's a restaurant around here closes about 9 o'clock. So I'm afraid that I'm going to have to leave to replenish.